So this is a second honeymoon for your birth. What do you say about it?
Well, it really is the first. We didn't have one at all. We were working when we were married and didn't get away, and then...
There are some lives that look strong from the outside and silent from within. Barbara Stanwyck was one of those lives. To the world, she was unbreakable, sharp, controlled, untouchable. But behind that strength was a woman who had learned, very early, that love doesn't always protect you. Sometimes it changes you. She was married. She was admired. She was surrounded by some of Hollywood's most powerful men. And yet, by the end of her life, one quiet truth remained. Not the man she stayed with, not the man the world expected, but the one she never truly let go. And she never needed to say his name out loud, because her life already had. The marriage that changed her forever. Before the fame, before the control, there was a version of Barbara Stanwyck that still believed love could feel safe. When she married Frank Fay in 1928, it looked like a step forward, a rising young actress and a successful, well-known performer. From the outside, it made sense. Stability, opportunity, a future. But what looked secure slowly became something else. Fay was dominant, often unpredictable, and as the years passed, that unpredictability turned into something heavier. There were reports of drinking, of harsh behavior, of a household where control replaced comfort. Stanwyck, who had already known loss early in life, found herself in a different kind of instability, one that didn't come from absence, but from presence. They adopted a son, Dion, and for a moment, it seemed like something solid might hold them together. But even that couldn't fix what was quietly breaking underneath. And here is where something inside her began to change. She didn't explode. She didn't collapse. She adjusted. She learned how to stay composed when things felt uncertain, how to protect herself emotionally, even while still standing beside someone. It wasn't strength the way the world saw it. It was survival. By 1935, the marriage ended. No dramatic confession, no public unraveling, just a quiet exit, and a woman who walked away different than she entered. Because from that point on, Barbara Stanwyck would never approach love the same way again. She would still feel it. She would still experience it. But she would never again trust it completely. The man she lost before love could begin. Long before Hollywood gave her a name, before the cameras, before the image the world would come to know, Barbara Stanwyck was still Ruby Stevens, trying to find her place on the stage. It was there, in those early Broadway days, that she crossed paths with Rex Cherryman. He wasn't just another actor. He was confident, established, and already respected in a world she was still learning to navigate. And for someone like Stanwyck, who had grown up without steady guidance, there was something grounding about his presence. This wasn't a dramatic romance. There were no headlines, no declarations. But there was something quieter, and perhaps more important, a sense of possibility, the kind that doesn't need to be spoken to, be felt. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. In 1928, Cherryman died suddenly from septic poisoning. He was only 31. There was no time for anything to grow. No time to understand what it might have become, just an abrupt ending to something that had barely begun. And for Stanwyck, that kind of loss doesn't disappear. It settles, it teaches, because this wasn't the pain of a broken relationship. It was the absence of one that never had the chance to exist. And in its own way, that can stay even longer. She didn't talk about it. She didn't need to. But moments like this quietly shape how a person sees the future. Love, in her world, was becoming something uncertain, something that could vanish without warning, something that could be taken before it even had a name. And somewhere inside her, another layer of distance formed. Not visible, not dramatic, just enough to make sure that next time, she wouldn't step in quite as freely. The one man she truly gave her heart to. By the time Barbara Stanwyck met Robert Taylor, she was no longer the woman she had once been. She was stronger, more controlled, careful, and yet something about him made that control feel unnecessary. Taylor was different from the men who had come before, calm, composed, and quietly ambitious. Where Stanwyck carried emotional weight, he carried ease. Where she protected herself, he seemed untouched by that kind of caution. It wasn't immediate, it wasn't loud, but it was real. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to lean into it. She didn't just love him, she invested in him. At that point, she was already more established in Hollywood, and she used that position to help guide his early career at MGM. She believed in him, supported him, and stood beside him not just as a partner, but as someone building something together. That mattered to her, because this time it felt balanced, safe, different. They married in 1939, and for a while, it worked. Not perfectly, but honestly. There were no signs of the instability she had known before, no immediate cracks, just a life that, from the outside, seemed grounded in mutual respect. But what made this love different wasn't how it began. It was how deeply she allowed herself to feel it. She trusted him completely, and for a woman who had learned to hold parts of herself back, that kind of trust wasn't small. It was everything. She didn't say it in words. She didn't need to. It showed in how she stood beside him, how she supported him, how she built a life around him. Because this wasn't just another relationship. This was the one where Barbara Stanwyck stopped protecting herself and finally gave her whole heart. He was there, but he wasn't the one. After the end of her marriage to Robert Taylor, Barbara Stanwyck didn't fall apart. She didn't chase something new. She didn't try to recreate what she had lost. Instead, she became quieter, more controlled, as if somewhere along the way she had made a decision, not out loud, but permanently, that she would never again give someone the power to leave a mark that deep. Years passed, her career moved forward, and by the time she stepped into the Big Valley, she had become something almost untouchable. Not distant, but precise. Not cold, but careful. And then came Robert Wagner. He was younger, lighter in spirit, easy to be around in a way that didn't demand anything from her. Where her past had been heavy, he felt simple, and that simplicity mattered. They grew close. There was warmth, trust, a kind of quiet companionship that didn't ask questions she didn't want to answer. From the outside, it looked like something might be beginning again. But inside, it wasn't. Because this time, Barbara Stanwyck knew the difference. She enjoyed his presence, but never once mistook it for what she had lost. That was the difference. With Wagner, there was no risk, no surrender, no reaching into the parts of herself she had once opened without hesitation. She kept something back, not out of fear, but out of understanding. Because she had already lived through the kind of love that changes you once, and only once, and she wasn't going back there. So what they shared remained exactly where she could manage it. Steady, respectful, contained. It worked because it didn't ask too much, because it didn't ask for her heart, and maybe that's why it lasted as long as it did. But even in its quiet closeness, one truth never shifted. It wasn't the same, not even close. They had chemistry, but not a real love. There are some connections that look like love from the outside. On screen, Barbara Stanwyck and William Holden had it all. Timing, tension, presence. The kind of chemistry that feels effortless and convincing. Audiences believed it. Hollywood noticed it. And naturally, the rumors followed. Because when something looks that real, people assume it must be. But what existed between them was something more restrained, more professional, more controlled. Holden was talented, charismatic, and known for his own complicated personal life. He moved through Hollywood with a different kind of energy, one that didn't quite align with the quiet discipline Stanwyck had built for herself over the years. And that difference mattered. There may have been admiration, there may have been moments of closeness, but there is no strong evidence that it ever became something deeper, no sustained relationship, no emotional entanglement that changed her life. And that distinction is important, because by this point, Barbara Stanwyck understood exactly where to draw the line. She had already lived through love that demanded everything, and love that left something behind when it ended. She had already learned what it meant to lose control emotionally, and she wasn't going back there. So what existed with Holden stayed where it was safest, within the frame, within the work, within something she could step into and step away from. It looked intense, it felt believable, but it didn't stay. Because this wasn't about finding love again, it was about maintaining distance from it, and in that way, their connection tells you more about who she had become than who she once was. The names people got wrong about her. By the later years of Barbara Stanwyck's life, something interesting began to happen. Her story started to grow. Beyond the truth, names were added, connections were assumed, and like many figures from Hollywood's golden age, her personal life slowly became a mix of fact and interpretation. Two of those names, Farley Granger and Helen Ferguson, often appear in that conversation, but when you look closely, they tell a different kind of story. Farley Granger worked with Stanwyck as a co-star. Their connection was professional, built on respect, timing, and shared presence on screen. Off-screen, Granger was open about his own life and relationships, which followed a very different path. There's no credible evidence of a romantic involvement between them, and yet, over time, the idea persisted. Not because it was true, but because people wanted more from the story. The same goes for Helen Ferguson. She was part of the same industry, moving through similar circles. An actress who later became a publicist. There was familiarity there, likely friendship, perhaps professional overlap. But again, nothing that points to romance. So why do these names stay attached to Stanwyck? Because when a woman lives with that much strength, that much independence, people look for explanations. They try to fill in the quiet spaces. They assume there must have been more. But in her case, the opposite is closer to the truth. There wasn't a long list of hidden loves. There were very few, and that's what makes her story different. Because instead of being defined by many relationships, Barbara Stanwyck was defined by how carefully she chose them, and how rarely she allowed them to matter. The love she never replaced. By the time the years had settled, and the noise of Hollywood had faded into memory, Barbara Stanwyck was left with something quieter. Not regret, not longing in the way people imagine, but something more controlled, more permanent. A memory that never quite left. After her divorce from Robert Taylor, she didn't rebuild her life around another man. She didn't search for something similar. She didn't even try to recreate what she once had. She simply moved forward, carefully, deliberately. But here is the part that matters. She never remarried. Not because she couldn't, not because there were no opportunities, but because, in a way she never openly explained, there was nothing that felt equal to what she had already experienced. And that silence speaks louder than any confession ever could. Because people who move on replace. They find new versions, new beginnings. Barbara Stanwyck didn't. She had connections, she had companionship, she had respect and admiration from many, but she never gave herself in that same way again. Not fully, not completely. And when you look at a life like that, not through rumors, not through headlines, but through choices, you begin to see the answer clearly. The man she trusted the most, the man she built something real with, the man she never truly replaced. It wasn't the one who came later. It wasn't the ones people speculated about. It was the one she once allowed herself to love without holding anything back. And even after it ended, that didn't change. Because some loves don't stay in your life. They stay in you. And his name was Robert Taylor. There are love stories that the world celebrates, and then there are the ones that live quietly, long after the ending. Barbara Stanwyck never gave the world a final confession. She never stood in front of a camera and named the man who meant the most. She didn't need to. Because when you look at her life, not the rumors, not the headlines, but the choices she made, the answer is already there. She loved, she lost, and then she chose never to feel that way again, not because she was cold, but because she remembered. And maybe that's the kind of love that stays the longest, the one you never replace. If this story meant something to you, take a moment, like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories that bring the past back to life, quietly, honestly, and with the respect these legends deserve.